All right, guys, so now we're going to start to get into context, which is a better way to store and manage our global state, which in our case is our feedback items. So context, as you can see from the docs, is a way to provide or provides a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level, which is what we've been doing up to this point. So if we look at our app.js, this is where we're storing our feedback state as well as any functions to manipulate that state. And then for any components that need them, we've been just passing it in through props. We pass in the feedback directly to stats and to our feedback list, and then we pass in any functions that we need to use into, we have add feedback into our form and delete into the list. So I don't want to have to do this. What I'd rather do is move our global state and any functions to manipulate that state into context and then bring it into the components directly. So you can do it this way. I mean, for this little project, this is fine. But as your project grows, you can just imagine like the amount of state and functions you'd have that you'd have to pass down, and you might have 3 or 4 component levels deep that you're passing props, and it can just get really messy. So context gives us a nice way to clean that up. All right, now the first thing we're going to do is in our source folder, create a new folder called context. And in here, we're going to create a new file called feedback context.js. Now, this is a very small application. Our global state really just consists of our feedback. But if it were a larger application, you might have different contexts for users and for products or whatever type of resources your application is using. But I think that this is a nice little project to kind of introduce you to how this works. So first thing we want to do is import create context, and we're also going to import the use state hook from React. Okay, and then to create our context, we can just create a variable here. Let's call it feedback context, and we're going to set that to create context. Now we have to create what's called a provider, because in order for our components down here, because we're no longer going to be passing in all these props, in order for these to get access to our state and our context, we're going to wrap everything in a provider, much like how we wrapped everything in this router in order to use these route components. So that's what we're going to create now. So we'll export const, and this is going to be called feedback provider. And since we're going to be wrapping everything, wrapping all of our components, this is going to take in children. Just like when we create a component that takes in children. And then what we want to return from this is going to be feedback context dot provider. Okay, and inside here is going to be whatever we wrap, which will be the children that's passed in, which will ultimately be all of our components that need access to our context. And then any values that we want to pass in, like our state or any functions to use, are going to be passed into a prop of value, and this is going to be an object. Now, as far as our state goes, I'm going to use the use state hook. There's other ways to do this. You can create reducers, which we'll get into later on in the course, but we're going to keep it simple since we don't have much state, and just use just like we did in the app.js, we'll have feedback set feedback and set that to use state. And as far as default values, I'm just going to pass in a single item here. Just call it, we'll do ID1, we'll do text, and I'm just going to say this item is from context, and then we'll have a rating. Okay, so that's our state. Now I want this feedback state, I want to pass down into my components that need it. So I'm going to put it in this value right here. So I'm going to say feedback, okay, which is just shorthand for doing this, right? Okay, so I'll save that. Actually, we need to export the context. So let's go down here and let's say export default feedback context. All right, now to bring it in, let's go to our app.js. And let's go up here. We'll go right below where we imported the about page, and let's say import we want to bring in our provider, because remember, we have to wrap everything in the provider. So let's say feedback provider, and that's going to be from our context file, which is going to be ./context/feedback context. And the feedback provider is being exported here, right? So it's not a default export. That's why I have the curly braces around it. So now we want to surround everything in that provider. So I'm going to go right here in the return at the top, and let's say feedback provider, and we just want to wrap everything. So put this down here below the router. Okay, good. Now, if we open up our dev tools, we should be able to see this. So let me just make this a little bigger here. And then I'm going to go to components, and let's go to our feedback provider. So you can see it. You can see our component tree here along with our context. And if we look at our feedback provider, if we look at the state, we have one item in our state. It's the one that I just created that says this item is from context. Okay, later on we're actually going to create a mock backend with JSON server, and we'll be fetching items from there. But for now it's just hard coded. But you can see that it is being provided. And now in the next video, what I want to show you is how we can get that state and bring it into the components that need it. Okay, in the last video we created our feedback context. We have our provider here with our state, which right now just has this one item, and then we're providing that feedback, that array with that one item through this value in our provider. And our provider is being wrapped around all of our components. So now I want to show you how do we get that state, how do we get that data from our context. And we're going to start off with the feedback list right here. Right now it's getting passed in the feedback from the app.js, right, which ultimately is coming from that feedback data file. But let's go into our list component. So we're going to open that up, feedback list, and let's go ahead and bring in a new hook that we haven't used yet called use context. So we're going to go up here and import use context. We want to bring that in from React. Okay, and this is how we can, as the hook says, use context. Now we do have to bring in our feedback context, since that's the specific context we want to use. I'm going to bring that in down here. So feedback context, and we want to bring that in from, and let's go up out of the components into context and then into feedback context. And then all we have to do is go into our component function. We'll go up at the top here, and we can extract whatever we want from our feedback context by using our use context hook and then passing in whatever context we want to use, which in our case is feedback context. And like I said, you might have different types of contexts. Now what I want to get and what we have access to is anything that is in this value, which right now is just the feedback itself, which is this one item. So let's go ahead and take that out. And before we were just passing in feedback as a prop. We're not going to do that anymore, so we can actually get rid of this feedback as a prop. And then we can also get rid of, if we have any prop types for that, yeah, we have our feedback prop types. We no longer even need that, so we can get rid of that. We can also get rid of bringing in prop types. We do have the handle delete, but that's also going to go away too. So now if I save this, you'll see what we're seeing on the screen is just that single item, which is now coming from our context. It's no longer coming from the app.js file. So it's as easy as that. Whenever we want to use any of our global state or have any functions that are in the context, we can simply use the use context hook and take out what we need and use it in the component. So now, since we're not passing feedback into feedback list as a prop anymore, we can go into our app.js and we can now get rid of this. Okay, so that's basically like the first step. Now let's also let's deal with this. Our stats right here, you can see it says 3 reviews. That's because it's still pertaining to the feedback that's in our app.js. So we're basically going to do the same thing. Let's open up our feedback stats, and just like we did in the list, let's bring in, let's see, first of all, we need use context in our stats, so we'll bring that in. And then let's bring in our feedback context into stats. And we're going to do the same thing that we did right here. We're going to pull the feedback from the context, and that goes inside the function like that. And then we no longer need to pass in feedback as a prop because we're getting it from the context. We no longer need prop type since there's no props. We no longer need this. And now when I save this, this 3 reviews should turn to 1 because now we're pertaining to our context feedback. Okay, so now you can see we have 1 review, average rating of 10 because that's what I have right here. So we can close up stats, and if we go in our app.js, we no longer need to pass in feedback into our stats. So you can see this is already starting to clean up. So in the next video, I want to move the functions, this add feedback and delete feedback, which we have right here. I want to move that into our context as well, so we won't have to pass these in here. We'll then be able to delete all of this stuff here. So we'll get to that next. All right, guys, so now we're fetching our data from our context, our global state in our context, but I want to move these functions there as well. So let's start with the delete. So this delete feedback right here, I'm actually going to cut that, and I'm going to put that in my feedback context. And we're going to put this, let's see, so we have our state. We're going to go right under our state and above the return, and we're going to paste that in. And let me see, there's really nothing we need to change here because we're still taking in the ID, and we're calling set feedback, and we're using that now just within our context, and then we're filtering out whatever feedback item we want to delete. Now, in order to use this in a component, we have to pass it in the value just like we did our feedback. Okay, so you can pass your function in too. So let's pass that in there. Let's save. And then let's see, we'll go back to our app.js, and our feedback list is where we're passing in this handle delete. We no longer need to do that, so we can get rid of that. Now let's go into our feedback list, and from here we were catching that prop of handle delete, which we no longer need, so we can get rid of that. And let's see, down here we have our feedback item, which is where the actual event is to click the X, but we had to pass that in as a prop, so we can get rid of that. And yeah, so that should be cleared up. We can save that. And now let's go into our feedback item, which is right here. And we no longer need this handle delete here, so we can get rid of that. And we can instead bring in our use context. So let's go right here, and let's import use context from React. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing that we did in the other components. Let's import the context itself. So feedback context, that's going to be from let's see, where are we? Dot slash context slash feedback context. And then we just want to go within the function here and pull out whatever we want from the feedback context. In this case, it's going to be, whoops, I'm sorry, we need to wrap this in use context. All right, so we'll wrap that, and then what we want to pull out is the delete feedback. Okay, so that's the function that's in the context. And then down here, instead of calling handle delete on the click, we're simply going to call delete feedback. And now if I come over here and I click on the X, it should get deleted. It's now getting deleted from our context. If I reload, it's going to come back, obviously, because it's still hard-coded. It's just hard-coded in a different place. So now that we can delete, let's take care of the add. So in our app.js, we have our add feedback. Let's go ahead and cut that now. Let's bring that into our context. And let's see, so we're using the UUID package here. So what I'm going to do is cut that from our app.js since we're no longer needing it here, and let's bring it into our context up at the top because we do want to create an ID. And then we're just setting feedback. It's going to get passed in the new feedback, so we shouldn't have to change anything there. We just have to make sure that we add it down here so that we can use it in our components that it's provided to. So where we want to use that is in our form. Now in our app.js, we no longer need the state, period. This right here, we can get rid of that. Yeah, so we can really clean this up. We no longer need to bring in the data file. We no longer need use state. We no longer need to pass in handle add because we're going to do it right from the form. So this file has really cleaned up. Now let's go into our form. Let's see, where are we? Feedback form. And we're no longer getting handle add passed in, so we can get rid of that. And let's go ahead and bring in use context. Let's see, import feedback context, and that's going to be from .. All right, and then let's go, since we have state in this function, I'm going to go right below the state and do this. So we're going to pull out add feedback and set that to use context, and then pass in our feedback context. And then add feedback, we're just going to simply call that down here in our submit where we were doing the handle add. We're going to change that to add feedback, which is going to get called from our context. All right, so I think that should do it. Let's try it out. We're going to come over here and let's say this is a test. We'll give it a 4. And there we go. And you can see that the stats updated to 2. So everything is now based in our context as far as our global state goes. It's all out of the app.js. Our app.js looks nice and neat. So you can see the benefit to this, especially if you plan on, you know, really scaling your application and adding more things to it. If you're going to have user authentication and all that, you're not going to want to do that all in your app.js file. So what I want to do next is add some update functionality, because right now we can read our items, we can add, we can delete, but I'd like to have a little icon here that we can click and then set some kind of flag for the form so that we can edit, basically put it in edit mode and have these values put up here so we can submit and we can update an individual item. So I do want to do that. Before we move on to the next video though, I'm just going to go into my context and just change this real quick. Let's just say this is feedback item 1, and then what we'll do is just copy this down. We'll have 3 of these. I mean, you can bring the file back in if you'd like, but I'm just going to do this. Doesn't really matter. Later on we're going to have this come from a mock backend. Let's see, we'll do 7 here. All right, so I think that's good for now. Okay, so yeah, in the next video we'll start to work on our update functionality. Okay, so now I want to be able to edit these feedback items, and there's a little bit that goes into this, because I want to have an icon here that we can click and then basically have whatever data is in this item, including the text and the rating, I want that to then show in this form. Okay, and then we'll be able to submit the form and update that specific item. So we're going to have to add another piece of global state, which is basically going to be a flag to tell us which item is being edited when we click on the icon. Okay, so that's pretty much what we're going to work on in this video. The actual update we'll do in a separate video. So let's go to the actual list of, not feedback list, feedback item, because that's where I want to have the icon. So we already have the FA times icon being brought in, which is our X to delete. So let's also bring in FA edit, which is like a pencil icon. And then we're going to go down. Let's see, we have our button here that calls delete feedback in our context. I'm going to go right under that button. And let's add another and give this a class of edit, which will position it correctly. I have that as a class in my global CSS. And then we'll do FA edit for the font awesome icon. And I'm just going to give this a color of purple like the other one. So if I save that, we should now see this button here. So when we click this, like I said, we basically want to set something in the global context. So I'm going to go now to my feedback context, and then from here where we have our state. So right now we just have this feedback, which right now is hard coded, and I'm going to add another piece of state here. So directly under that, let's say const. Scroll down a little bit here. Let's say const, and then I'm going to call this feedback edit. And then the function to change this will be called set feedback edit. And let's set this to use state. And then what we're going to have in here is an object with an item. And that item is going to be whichever one we're editing. So by default, it's just going to be an empty object. But what I want to do is whenever we click on one of these, that particular item, including the ID, the rating, and the text, will go into this item here. And then I also want to set a Boolean, I'll call it edit, which will be set to false. So basically, if we click it, it'll be set to true, meaning we're in edit mode. And if it's not clicked, then it'll be set to false. So that's another piece of global state. Now we want to update this piece of state when we click on that button, right? So let's create a function down here. So we'll say const, and I'm going to call this edit feedback. And this is going to take in the item because we need to know which item we're editing. And then let's call set feedback edit. And then we want to pass in here an object, and it's going to get filled with that item. And then we're also going to set edit to true. All right, so that will set that. Let's just put some comments here. So this will set item to be updated. And then we might as well just add here to add feedback, delete, oops, delete feedback. All right, so that function, if we want to use this edit feedback, we then have to pass it into our value down here in the provider. So let's say edit feedback. And now that we've done that, we can go back to our feedback item, and we basically want to bring that in. So in order to do that, we need to bring, we already have use context, right? We're already getting delete feedback, so now we can just also get edit feedback. All right, so we have that edit feedback function, and we just want to call that when we click on this edit button. So let's say on click, and let's set that to, since we're passing in the item, we're going to have a function here, and then we're going to call edit feedback, and we'll go ahead and pass in the item. Okay. Now nothing's going to happen in the UI just yet, so what we can do is we can use our React Dev Tools. So let's go to components, and then we should see our global state. If we click on this feedback provider, you can see right here, state, we have our item, and we have edit false. Item is blank. Now if I click on this one here, let's go ahead and click it, and you'll see that that'll get filled. So now we have an item object, the ID of 2, because that's the one I clicked, and it has the text, it has the rating, and it has edit true. If I click on this one, then you'll see the ID of 1 gets put in there. So whatever we click here now is going to get put in that piece of global state. Now in the next video, we want to basically fill this form with whatever we click. If it's in edit mode, which if I click on this it is, I want that to reflect in the form here so we can get ready to actually update that item. All right guys, so now what we want to do when we click on one of these, we want it to show in this form. So this form has to know what is in that piece of state. If we look at our context, we now have this this feedback edit, right, which is an object with the actual item to be edited, and a Boolean if it's in edit mode or not. So this feedback edit, we need to actually add that down here as a value that we can provide to our form component. So let's say feedback edit. And I know this might be a little confusing how I named it. Just know that edit feedback is the function that runs when we click this, and then this is the actual piece of state that holds the item and the Boolean. So the form needs to know this, right? So let's save that, and then let's go to our form. So we can go to feedback form, and from here, basically, we want to, from our feedback context, we're already getting the add feedback function, right? For when we submit this, we also want to get that feedback edit value, or that object, right? This is not the function. The function is called edit feedback. This is feedback edit, which is that object with the item and the Boolean. So now that we're getting that, basically whenever this changes, right, because it changes whenever we click on this, we want something to happen. We want this form to get the text and the rating from the current feedback. Now that's called an effect or a side effect, and the way that we deal with side effects with functional components and hooks is with a specific hook called useEffect. So let's bring in useEffect. And the way that this works is we come down and we add useEffect. So we basically call it as a function, and it takes in a callback. And it also takes a second argument here of an array of dependencies, meaning if you put something in here and it changes, this is going to run. Now, if you leave this empty, it's just going to run when the component loads. So right now, I'm just going to do a console log here. Just say console log hello, and if I open up my console, we should see hello as soon as the page loads, or I should say as soon as this component loads. And this is a good way to make HTTP requests. Let's say this was like a blog post component and you had to fetch data from an API. When the page loads, you would do that here. You would do your fetch request here, and you would most likely leave this empty just to have it run once. Now, we don't want it to run once. We want it to run whenever we click on any of these. So this feedback edit, that changes when we click on here. So we want to add that as a dependency. Okay, so we'll add feedback edit in there. Now, if I save that, anytime I click on this, it has that side effect of, well, whatever we do in here. Right now, we're just console logging, but this useEffect is going to run whenever I click on it. Now, what do we want to happen when we click on an edit? We basically want to add the text and the rating. Okay, we want to add that to the state. We also want to set the button to be enabled because it's disabled by default. So first thing we'll do, actually before we do that, we want to make sure we run a check to see if edit actually, if this has something in it. If not, it's going to run when the component loads, and we don't want that. So let's check to see if feedback edit, and remember that has an edit value in it, which is a Boolean. We want to make sure that that's true. If that's true, then we want to first set the button disabled. We want to set that to false so that the button gets enabled. We want to set the text value to whatever is in feedback edit dot item, that's the object, and then dot text. And then we also want to do the same with the rating. So rating, and let's go ahead and set rating. So, and you can already see, since I clicked, the last one I clicked here was 3, we already have that item in the state. So if I reload this and I click on this first one here, this edit, we should see the button get enabled. We should see the text here. Now, the one thing that's not going to change in as far as what we can see in the UI is the rating. This one has a rating of 9. If I click this, the text goes in there. The rating doesn't show though, and the reason for that is because the rating, that's a separate component, right? If we go down here, that's the rating select component. So the rating is actually getting set in the state for the form, but we're just not seeing it because it's not showing in the rating select. And actually I can show you with the React Dev Tools, and this is why the React Dev Tools are very helpful. So if we go to, let's see, our form, you can see this right here, the rating is at 9. If I click on this one right here, it's set to 7. So it has the right data, but it's just not visualized because we need to set that within the rating select component. So let's do that. And the way we do that is basically bringing that feedback edit, this right here, we want to bring that into the rating select component as well. So let's go into that, and we need to bring in use context, because remember, whenever we want to get anything from our context, we need to do it this way. We'll go ahead and copy from the form. We'll copy, let's see, we need to bring in the feedback context as well. So let's bring that in. And then we need to take out, let's just copy this because we need the feedback edit value. So we'll go right under the state. And we don't need add feedback, we just want feedback edit. Okay, so we're getting that value within our rating select. Now to set it as displayed here, we're going to bring in use effect just like we did in the form. And then let's call that right here, use effect. And that takes in a function. And then, excuse me, as far as dependencies for the use effect, it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be that feedback edit. And then what we'll do in here is set the selected, because that's what's being displayed here is whatever is selected. So we'll do set selected, and we want to set that to whatever is in feedback edit dot item dot rating. And that should visually show us the correct rating. So let's save that, and now you'll see it's set to 7. This one has a rating of 9. If I click that, the text goes in there, the button is enabled, and then from what we just did, it's going to show the correct rating. This one, if I click that one, that shows 10. All right, so now we're able to actually get the data in the form that we need. So in the next video, we'll do the update so we can actually submit it and it will update. Because right now, if I click it, it's just going to add a new one because that's what we have it set to do. We have it set to add the feedback. All right, so that's what we'll get to in the next one. We'll start to work on the update. Okay, so now we have it to the point where we can click on any of these edit buttons and it puts the data from that particular item into the form ready to get updated. But right now we're just calling add feedback if we click this, and it just adds a new one, which we don't want. So first thing we want to do is in our context, let's create a new function to actually update the data. So let's say update feedback item. So we'll say const, and we'll call this update feedback. And this is going to take in, it's going to take in two things. One is going to be the ID. So we need to know which one we're updating, and then we'll call this UPD item. This is going to be the new data, the new updated item. Okay, and then let's make a function here that for now just console logs. We'll log both things. So ID and update item. So now this update feedback needs to be accessed from the form, meaning we have to add it down here. So let's put this, actually, you know what, let's move that up there just so we have the functions down below here. So update feedback, we're going to now pass that in. So in the form now, we're already getting from our context, we're already getting add feedback, we're also getting the feedback edit state. So let's go ahead and also get update feedback. Okay, so now we can call this function, and where we want to call this obviously is where we submit. So let's go down to handle submit, and you can see right now we're just calling add feedback. So what we can do here is just set a conditional. So we'll say if feedback edit, so if that, and then we have a boolean in there called edit, we'll say if that is equal to true, then we'll go ahead and call update feedback. Now we already have this, we're already constructing this new feedback object up here, so we can pass that in. Let's say update feedback, and we're going to pass in feedback edit and then the item ID, because remember it takes in the ID and then it takes in the updated feedback, which is going to be this object here, new feedback. Okay, and then we'll do an else, then we're going to have this add feedback get called. If there's nothing to be edited, then obviously we want to add it. So let's go ahead and open up our console. I I'm gonna have to fix the CSS for this question mark. Just ignore that for now. But if I go ahead and click one of these and then submit, oh, actually let's change it. So we'll say 8, and then let's just do, we'll say updated feedback. And if I send, we should see that in the console. We see the ID and we see the newly updated feedback item. So now let's go to our context and let's take care of this. And basically what we want to do is call set feedback, and we want to return an array with the newly updated item. And we can do that by taking the current feedback array, and we want to call .map on that. And that takes in an arrow function, and let's pass in item. So basically for each feedback, we're calling it item. And then for each one, we want to run a condition and say, is that item ID equal to the ID that's being passed in that we want to update? If so, then we want to spread across the current item here and then the updated item. Actually want to add spread to that too. Else, so if it doesn't match the ID, then obviously we just want to return the current item. All right, so let's go ahead and save that, and then we'll try this out. So this second one has a rating of 9. Let's click on this. We'll change the rating to 7, and I'm going to just edit the text here and say this is a test. Okay, and you can see that that has now updated. This is a test, and it's changed to the rating of 7. If I click on this one here, let's change the rating to 4, and we'll just say hello world 1 save, and that gets updated. Okay, so we now have update functionality, and obviously again, if we reload, it's going to go back to the hard-coded state. What I'd like to do next is have this mimic a more real-world application, because you're most likely going to have some kind of back end, some kind of API that you deal with that stores the data instead of just putting it in the UI. So in the next video, or next couple videos, we're going to be working with something called JSON Server, which is basically like a mock back end. So React is a front-end framework, and it's used for the front end, but we'll have JSON Server. We can kind of pretend that someone built that back end for us to use. All right, so we'll get into that next. Okay, so before we move on to adding JSON Server as our mock back end, I want to show you how you can build out your static assets and how you can deploy a front-end application. And we're going to ultimately deploy to a platform called Netlify, which has a very generous free tier. And it's as simple as pushing to GitHub and then just selecting your GitHub repo in Netlify. There's also other platforms like Vercel, which is really good. And then, of course, you have like AWS, and maybe you have cPanel. You have all different types of options when it comes to hosting. But to create a production build, as you can see right here with our server running, it says run npm run build. So I'm going to stop the server with Command C, and I'm going to run npm run build. And what that's going to do, as you can see, it's going to create an optimized production build, and it's going to create it in a folder called build. So you should see this appear. And then you have your static files, you have your index.html, and so on. And if you want to actually serve the production build, what I do is I have a package called serve that I installed globally. So if you want to do that, you can do npm install -g and then serve. Once you do that, you can run, let's say, serve -s, and then let's serve what's in the build folder. Okay, so none of this other stuff matters. We don't have to run our dev server. This is just going to serve what we have in our static build folder. So let's run that. And it's going to serve it on localhost 5000. So if I go over and I go to localhost 5000, you're going to see the production build of this application. And it should work, so we can test it out. Let's say this is a test. And you can see that it works. If we want to edit one of these, we'll say this is item whatever, 10,000, 100,000, and you can see that edits, that updates. We can also delete. And obviously it's still all in the UI, so it's not going to stick. That's what we're going to add JSON Server for, is to show you how we would build this with a back end. But yeah, so you could upload this build folder, or what's in this build folder, to any host that you want. Now let's get into deploying to something like Netlify. So first of all, you want to create a GitHub repository, and I've already done this. I've been adding commits as we've been moving along. You can see I just made one 14 minutes ago. So basically you want to first initialize a Git repo. So you would do git init, and I'm not going to run this because I already have. So git init. Then you would add all your files to the staging area with git add dot. Okay, that would add them to staging. And then you would commit. So we'd say git commit -m, and then some comment. You could do like initial, something like that. And this is if you haven't been making commits along the way, which I'm sure a lot of you have. So that would commit it. Then you would want to create your GitHub repo right here. You'd add a new repository, right? Call it whatever you want. And then once you do that, you'll have, you know what, I'll just do it just to show you, just for those of you that have never really done this. So I'll just say test, make it private. So you create your GitHub repo, and then what you would do is grab this, because you want to add this as your remote repository. So you would copy this, paste it in, and then you would run this. Okay, after you did what we just went through, adding and then committing. Once it's in your local repository, you could then push to GitHub. Okay, so then you would have, you know, something like, let's go back here. So you would have it like this. So this is my app that I want to deploy. So what I'll do now is go to Netlify, just go ahead and create an account, log in, and then we can say new site from Git. And I'm going to choose GitHub. You can also use Bitbucket and GitLab. So I want to choose, let's see, feedback. So I want to choose my feedback app right here, which is private right now. And then I'm going to deploy to the main branch. The build command is npm run build, and the build directory is build. So we don't have to run npm run build before we deploy to Netlify. We just simply need to have a GitHub repo. Now we can say deploy site, and you can see site deploy in process. And then once that's done, you'll see a custom domain here, and you can add your own domain. You can just click right here and go through the steps, but let's go ahead and click on that. And now we have our application live on the internet at this domain. And again, you want to check things out here. There's no reason it shouldn't work. It's all client side, but you just want to check it. So we'll change that to, let's change that to a 1, send. Good, we can delete. Cool. So that's how you can deploy. Vercel is another great platform, and it's a similar process. And I'm not sponsored by any of these companies. These are just companies and services that I use myself that I would highly recommend. All right, so that's it. Now let's move on to adding a mock backend with JSON Server.